Okay, so where did it all go so wrong for Kamala Harris and so right for Donald Trump? Well, let's bring in two guests. We've got David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and the author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America, and also The Making of Donald Trump. Two books there. We're also joined by the Republican strategist and political commentator, Scottie Nell Hughes. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Now, Scottie, let me turn to you first. Despite everything they said about him and everything that happened, the polls, the rhetoric, the court cases, being a convicted felon, assassination attempts, Trump has done it again. What did he get right?
Well, he got right was his message. He understood that Americans today did not feel better than they did 4 years ago at the end of his term. And he understood that he needed to once again communicate that effectively, that he was going to be the person to fix the problems that was created by the Biden-Harris administration. And he was, regardless of all these other sort of side circuses that the Democrats continue to try to make as the headlines, it ultimately came down to when people went into the polls that they felt like their money was better off underneath Donald Trump. They felt that their national security was a lot more secure under Donald Trump, and they themselves felt like that they had a better chance for their children and their families to have the American dream under Donald Trump than they did. And it was very hard for Kamala Harris to distance herself from the administration and the policies of the last 4 years because she was right there a part of them.
Okay, David, let's turn to you. Clearly, Donald Trump's appeal endures. We can't dispute that when you look at the numbers. He's getting that second term. Why do you think that is? And what do you think this says about modern America?
Well, Donald is a tremendous communicator. There's a reason that I call him the greatest con artist in the history of the world. And he knows how to find a message that will appeal to people, and he's very good at it. And the results yesterday show how successful he was. What's bizarre about them is that, in the words of The Economist, the American economy is the envy of the world. We've had more jobs created in the last 4 years than under every Republican president, including Donald Trump, back to 1948. The U.S. economy is just doing incredibly well, but Donald has persuaded, with the help of some news organizations that are notorious for their mendacity, that we're in a recession. He claims that all the new jobs have gone to illegals and other things that are just not supported by the facts. But, you know, people vote based on how they feel, and Donald has brilliantly captured that in this campaign. The other thing I'd point out is there was a big increase in I don't care votes. 21 million fewer people voted yesterday than voted 4 years ago. That's a significant drop from around 154 million voters to around 20 million. That is less than that.
Okay, thanks for that. Scottie, let me turn back to you and ask you, by all means, do respond to any of the comments made there, in particular that Donald Trump is a con artist there, in David's words. And this point that you were making of Americans voting with their pocketbooks, I mean, that's basically what every election boils down to, isn't it? But when you look at the numbers from the outside, you look at unemployment, you look at inflation, you look at GDP growth, none of it looks too bad. In fact, it looks quite good. I think quite a lot of countries would be quite envious. But clearly there's a massive mismatch between those numbers and perception on the streets. Why do you think that is?
Well, because I think the American people and the world should know that those numbers have been absolutely manipulated by this administration. Case in point, they used the benchmark, the starting off for all of their numbers, to be when the global economy and our state was in a pandemic. It's really easy to grow when you're at the very bottom levels. Of course, your numbers can grow. If you look at the realistic numbers of what the Biden administration has done, I think that's why the American people do not buy the fact that, you know, Biden administration, Harris tried to show that this was this great economy that we're living in. And it's absolutely not true when you're coming out of the grocery store spending $150 and carrying just 2 grocery sacks of eggs, bread, and sugar. That is one where people go, why is this administration continuing to lie to us? Not only that, but it has been so often done by this administration. They present the numbers, and then 2 months, 3 months later, they adjust them to the reality of the situation. They praise their originals, just like they did with not only the crime and safety numbers to say that, oh, America is safer than it's ever been. And then later on, the FBI came back and went, no, your numbers, you left out the major cities in the U.S. We're not that safe. They did the same things with the job market, where we are actually very much underreported what they said. And how much percentage of those jobs are government jobs? They're not private sector jobs. They're government jobs that were created to try to beef up the numbers as well. And how many of those jobs were actually full-time jobs versus part-time? The numbers have been manipulated underneath this administration so much that the American people do not trust what is coming out of this administration. And that's why we saw demographics that normally would never look at the Republican Party, look at them yesterday and go, I need to build trust back in my American faith in the American government. And I'm going to have to do it underneath Donald Trump because I cannot trust this administration any longer.
Okay, David, how do you respond? The Biden administration, the Democrats, they cook the books. They fib about unemployment rates. They botch the numbers with regards to crime. How do you respond?
This is malarkey, to use Joe Biden's phrase. I work with the official government data all the time and have for decades. The government makes revisions. They are standard and routine. There's been nothing out of the ordinary. We track the number of part-time jobs, and we know how many people hold 2 jobs, for example. And the data is very clear. This is an incredibly robust economy. And one of the interesting things some surveys have turned up, not political polls, but surveys, is many people say that they think that they're doing badly, but everyone around them is doing well. And I think this has to do with the messaging that Donald Trump and people who support him, who have little regard for the facts, have successfully foisted onto the American public. I mean, I've literally talked with several dozen people in the last month who say the United States is in a recession. The stock market doubled in the last 4 years. That's unheard of. 15 million jobs in the last 4 years. There's exactly zero evidence that the administration has mucked with the numbers. These are done by paid professionals. And yes, there are revisions. There are always revisions to the data. That's part of what tells you there's integrity in the data. We operate a huge operation in the United States to gather this data, which business relies on.
Okay, Scottie, feel free to respond. Anything you'd like to add to that before we move on to the next point?
Well, obviously, that's just not true. And the revisionist numbers were not just a couple thousand, it was a couple 100,000. And that is why the American people did what they did yesterday. Listen, Democrats, instead of sitting here and going after Donald Trump, and that's the response I was expecting today, the majority of Democrats have actually looked at each other and said, what did we do wrong? Why does the common man, the American worker, no longer feel like we're the party that they can identify with? Something that blue-collar workers have identified with the Democrats for decades. They've done a great job. And you know what? The GOP has done a horrible job with it. But Donald Trump, the man, has come in and said, no, I can actually help you. And he's done it in the past underneath his administration. People remember that. And so that is the promise that he is going to have to, and people will hold him accountable for that in these first 100 days. They're going to have to see some of the regulations that the Biden-Harris administration put in that basically strangled small business, strangled our individual solo farmers here in the country. They're going to have to see some of those just absolutely binding laws be taken away, so that once again the American economy can be a free economy again and can grow on its own organically and not be this self-inflated by the U.S. government, something that they've become used to, that unfortunately our economy has been used to for the last 4 years.
David, when your party does a post-mortem,
not my party. I'm not a Democrat.
Okay, when the Democrat
professor, I'm an investigative reporter.
Sorry, when the Democratic Party does a post-mortem and there's a bit of an analysis as to what went wrong, do you think they're going to say perhaps our campaign wasn't about real people enough? It wasn't about those real concerns that people have, affordability of food, putting food on the table, struggling families? Or do you think it will be more about wrong candidate, wrong running mate? What do you think some of the conclusions might be?
Well, I think it's going to take some time for the Democrats to analyze and figure out what went wrong here and why 21 million fewer people turned out to vote, indicating they were turned off to both of these candidates. I think the Democrats need to put a lot of time into the messaging, because all the things Scottie has been telling you about the economy, and I am well known for the care I take in the data that I present. No one ever in my career, and including White Houses, has questioned my use of data, except few people like Scottie who don't know what they're talking about. We have an incredibly strong economy, but people don't feel that way. I don't question that people don't feel that way. I think the Democrats are going to have to ask if America voted the way it did in part because of racism and sexism. Clearly, that's got to be a factor, but I don't know how much of a factor it is across the country. In urban areas where you have all tens of different people living together, Kamala Harris did much better. So I think there's some credence to that argument. And I think Harris's message was so focused on the concerns of women, particularly reproductive health care, that it turned off a lot of men. I think that's very clear. And just one last point about the economy. The decline in the wages of workers in America began with the Reagan administration's assault on unions. I've done, and other people have done, analyses that track the density of union membership and wages, and they track almost perfectly. Back in 1973, when 37% of private sector workers belonged to unions, about 80% of workers benefited. And so for anyone representing either the MAGA movement or the Republicans to lay this at the foot of Joe Biden, the most pro-union president in history, he actually walked a picket line, then that's just fact-free and absurd. But that's one of the elements of the MAGA movement that's very important. Donald Trump is a convicted felon. He's facing other criminal charges. I have documented over the last 36 years, and I was the first person to ever write about him becoming president in 1988,
All right.
36 years.
David, we're nearly at the end. We're nearly at the end of this conversation. Just want to give Scottie the last word because she's been quiet for the last couple of seconds.
Sure.
A golden age for America. That's what Donald Trump is saying. What's he got in mind in 30 seconds?
He's actually putting America first once again, that agenda. It was unfortunately stumped probably by his own party during his first term. He's coming in here actually knowing what he's doing. He's not just a businessman. Now he knows how politics works. And I think he's going to be there to represent all Americans, including the very disillusioned, non-independent journalists that I'm on with today.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. Scottie Nell Hughes, you've had the last word. David Cay Johnston, I'm really sorry we're out of time. Really appreciate you both taking the time to speak to us.